Millions of words have been written this week about the size of the crowds at Ali Khamenei's funeral. Almost none of them have looked closely at what's actually happening inside those crowds, because what's happening inside them tells a very different story than the one Iran's government wants broadcast. This isn't a unified nation mourning as one. It's a fractured political establishment using a funeral procession to fight out a succession battle in public, in front of international cameras, with two competing factions chanting different slogans at each other along the same 12-hour route. Start with what's actually confirmed, because the confirmed material alone is remarkable. Khamenei was killed on February 28th in the opening strikes of the war launched by the United States and Israel. His funeral didn't happen for more than 4 months, delayed by the ongoing hostilities and by security concerns that, as it turns out, never fully went away. When ceremonies finally began on July 4th, running across 6 days in multiple cities before burial at the Imam Reza Shrine in Mashhad, Iran's state media claimed millions of participants. Independent estimates from journalists and analysts on the ground describe something closer to hundreds of thousands at any single procession. Still an enormous crowd by any standard, but a meaningfully different number than the state's own claims. That gap matters, and it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing outright, because it's not just outside skeptics making this point. A professor of modern Iranian history at St. Andrews University put it plainly to Reuters this week. If anyone's treating this crowd size as a genuine popularity test for the Islamic Republic, history says otherwise, because Iranians do funerals, as a cultural and religious tradition, extremely well, regardless of their politics. Reuters spoke directly to people attending the processions, who said they were there as spectators, or out of religious duty tied to Shia mourning traditions, rather than out of any political loyalty to the regime itself. One Iranian housewife, declining to attend at all, told Reuters she saw no reason to be part of what she called a staged show, saying the government should instead be thinking about the economic problems ordinary Iranians are actually suffering through. Independent analysts assessing genuine public support for Iran's hardline leadership have put the real figure somewhere in the range of 15 to 20% of the population, a minority position dressed up through massive state-organized turnout to look like something closer to national consensus. Now to the part of this story that's actually the headline, because the funeral itself has become a visible battlefield for a fight happening inside Iran's own political establishment, and it's playing out through competing chants rather than closed-door memos. During the July 4th ceremony specifically, participants were recorded repeatedly chanting slogans including "Revenge, revenge," "Death to the infiltrator," "Death to the compromiser," and, most pointedly, "This is the final message. Negotiations are forbidden," a direct shot at the ongoing diplomatic track between Tehran and Washington. Alongside those chants, other attendees were shouting a different slogan entirely, "Labaik, Sayyid Mojtaba," an expression of loyalty specifically toward Khamenei's son and named successor. A leaflet circulated through the crowd carried a line that reads almost like a coded political message. "In principle, I held a different opinion. Return to the leader's position." Analysts covering the funeral have described this combination: competing slogans, competing loyalty signals, a leaflet hinting at internal disagreement, not as evidence of unity and a smooth transfer of power, but as a visible symptom of real infighting and competition among the regime's rival factions in the period immediately following Khamenei's death. That reading lines up with a detail that's been sitting in plain sight throughout the entire funeral period. Mojtaba Khamenei, the son actually named as the new supreme leader, has not appeared publicly at any point across 6 full days of ceremonies, honoring his own father. 3 of Khamenei's other sons, Mustafa, Masoud, and Maysam, none of whom had appeared publicly since the war began back in February, did attend, standing beside their father's coffin. Mojtaba specifically did not. Officials have offered a security explanation, and it's not an unreasonable one given that Israel's defense minister has stated directly that Mojtaba is marked for death, and that any future Iranian leader who pursues plans against Israel will meet the same fate his father did. But that explanation sits uncomfortably next to the fact that nearly the entire senior leadership of the regime did appear in public throughout the funeral, including the heads of all 3 branches of government and the commanders of both the IRGC and the Quds Force. If the security threat were serious enough to keep the actual supreme leader hidden for 6 consecutive days, it's a genuinely open question why it didn't keep everyone else hidden too. The most striking material from the funeral itself, and the material that's actually generating real diplomatic concern in Washington, involves how directly the crowds turned their anger toward the American president specifically. Mourners carried signs reading "Kill Trump" and "We will kill Trump" in large lettering. One widely circulated photograph showed a poster of Trump alongside the message, "There will be blood." During one portion of the procession, mourners took part in what's been described, based on footage released by the Iranian state-affiliated Mizan news agency, as a symbolic "stoning the devil" ceremony, an established ritual practice repurposed for the occasion with participants throwing pebbles at an image of Trump. Elsewhere along the route, an effigy of Trump was displayed hanging. One mourner, a 30-year-old woman named Zahra Valeh, told Reuters directly, "We will take revenge for the blood of our leader. We will not let the blood of our leader be trampled underfoot." Another mourner, identified as Fatima Hassan, told reporters plainly that the crowd wasn't there to say goodbye. They were there for revenge, and that they intended to take it. That is, by any reasonable standard, a direct and public call for the assassination of a sitting American president, made repeatedly across multiple days in front of international media that Iran's government chose to allow into the country for this event. Iran has, through official channels, repeatedly denied plotting to actually kill Trump. That denial sits awkwardly next to a documented history of hardline propaganda footage suggesting exactly that kind of targeting, and against the backdrop of a crowd chanting for his death on camera at the funeral of the man Trump's own strikes killed. Israel's response to all of this has been characteristically blunt. Defense Minister Israel Katz stated plainly that Khamenei was assassinated because he set in motion and personally led the plan to destroy Israel, framing it explicitly as the assassin was assassinated. He went further, warning that any future Iranian leader who tries to push forward plans to destroy Israel will face the same outcome, a direct public threat aimed squarely at whoever ultimately consolidates power in Tehran, Mojtaba or otherwise. That statement, delivered while Khamenei's funeral procession was still actively moving through Tehran's streets, is itself a genuinely remarkable moment. A sitting defense minister of one country publicly threatening the successor government of another country during that government's own head of state's funeral. Security around the entire event has reflected just how seriously Iran's government is taking the threat picture, regardless of what's said publicly. Iran closed its airspace over Tehran entirely during the procession. The IRGC issued a direct warning stating that any miscalculation during this period would be met with what it called a decisive and more crushing response than ever before, language explicitly aimed at deterring any attempt to strike the funeral itself, while millions of people, by Iran's own count, were gathered in dense crowds across the city. Analysts covering the region have noted that the appearance of senior officials like IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi in public, despite the assassination risk, might actually indicate confidence in the security measures in place, rather than recklessness, a read worth taking seriously given how deliberately Mojtaba specifically has avoided exactly that same exposure. There's an international dimension to this story that's been somewhat overshadowed by the drama unfolding inside Iran itself. Iran's exiled crown prince, Reza Pahlavi, called for a week of coordinated global protests to coincide with the funeral, and demonstrations did materialize outside Iranian and American diplomatic sites in multiple cities, London, Rome, Berlin, and elsewhere, with protesters waving the pre-revolutionary lion and sun flag alongside American and Israeli flags, specifically denouncing the American-Iranian Memorandum of Understanding as a betrayal of the Iranian people, rather than a genuine step toward accountability. In Berlin, activists staged a mock signing ceremony explicitly mocking both Trump and Mojtaba together, a pointed way of suggesting the diplomatic track itself is a form of theater conducted between illegitimate actors on both sides. That opposition movement, operating entirely outside Iran and with no formal power to shape what happens next, nonetheless represents a third distinct political current running alongside the hardline funeral chants and the more pragmatic negotiating track. A reminder that the Iranian diaspora's political alignment doesn't map cleanly onto either faction currently fighting for control inside the country. Diplomatically, the entire negotiating track between Washington and Tehran has been formally paused for the duration of the funeral period, a pause both governments agreed to explicitly, rather than one that simply happened by accident. That means every one of the disputes already simmering before the funeral began, the fight over nuclear inspection access, the disagreement over Strait of Hormuz tolls, the unresolved status of frozen Iranian assets, has been sitting completely static for nearly a week now, waiting for ceremonies to conclude before anyone resumes discussing them. Given the chants explicitly declaring negotiations forbidden, and given that those chants were coming from a faction openly competing for influence over whoever actually ends up running the country, there's a real, legitimate question about whether the negotiating track picks back up in anything resembling its previous form once the funeral period ends, or whether the hardline faction visible throughout this week's ceremonies has gained enough momentum to meaningfully constrain what Iran's actual negotiators are willing to offer going forward. It's worth being precise about what can and can't be concluded from all of this. What's solidly confirmed? Real, repeated filmed calls for Trump's assassination from large crowds at a state-organized event. Real documented factional tension expressed through competing chants and a leaflet hinting at internal disagreement over the succession. A real and continuing absence of the actual named supreme leader from his own father's funeral, despite nearly every other senior official in the government appearing, and real, on-record skepticism from independent historians and analysts about equating any of this crowd size with genuine, broad-based popular support for continued theocratic rule. What's considerably less clear is exactly how deep the infighting between Iran's negotiating establishment and its hardline factions actually runs, whether it represents a genuine struggle over the country's future direction or a more contained disagreement over tactics and messaging, and whether Mojtaba's continued absence reflects a serious security concern, a genuine health issue tied to reported wounds from the February strike that killed his father, or something closer to a deliberate strategic choice by a leadership still working out exactly how much public exposure its untested new figurehead can safely tolerate. What's not in question is that Iran chose to let international media into this event, chose to allow CNN, chose to allow the Associated Press, chose to allow reporters from outlets with no interest in flattering the regime's messaging. And that decision means the fractures on display this week weren't accidentally leaked. They were filmed in plain sight by cameras Iran's own government granted access to. A government fully confident in its own unity and its own popular support doesn't typically need reporters from CNN and the AP documenting competing chants and internal leaflets during its most solemn national ceremony. Whatever else remains uncertain about where Iran's leadership actually stands as this funeral period concludes. That specific detail, the choice to let the world watch this closely while the cracks were showing, tells its own story. It's worth adding some context about who actually turned up to this funeral, because the guest list itself is a small diplomatic story in its own right. Russia sent former President Dmitry Medvedev, a signal of continued Russian alignment with Tehran, even as Moscow remains preoccupied with its own war in Ukraine, a conflict Iran has separately supported through drone transfers. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif attended in person, consistent with Islamabad's role throughout this entire conflict as one of the primary mediating venues for U.S. Iran negotiations. Iraq's president attended, alongside Afghanistan's foreign minister and a delegation representing Hamas, a lineup that reads almost like a roster of Iran's remaining regional relationships after a war that's badly degraded several of its other traditional alliances. Former Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was also seen at the procession, a reminder that figures from earlier eras of the Islamic Republic's leadership are still politically present and watching how this succession plays out, even without formal roles in the current government. There's a historical echo running underneath all of this that Iranian authorities are almost certainly aware of, and it's worth understanding because it explains some of the extraordinarily heavy security posture around these ceremonies. When Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic and Khamenei's own predecessor, died in 1989, his funeral drew a crowd Iranian state media estimated at around 10 million people, a scale of mass mourning with genuinely chaotic and dangerous crowd dynamics that authorities have spent decades trying not to repeat. Reports from this week's ceremonies describe officials on loudspeakers explicitly urging mourners to walk slowly, avoid pushing, and stay toward the edges of the street, precautions clearly informed by that 1989 precedent, and by a general awareness that a funeral procession this size, moving through dense urban streets in extreme summer heat, carries real risk of crowd crush regardless of the political messaging happening simultaneously. Attendants sprayed misted water across crowds specifically to manage heat exposure during the procession, a detail that's easy to read as incidental, but actually reflects how seriously organizers were treating the physical safety risks of an event this size, even while simultaneously managing the political and security risks of assassination threats and factional tension playing out in the same crowd. The broader domestic context Iran's government is managing during this funeral deserves more attention than it's generally received, because it directly shapes how much genuine goodwill the regime can actually draw on right now. Iran's own human rights monitoring organizations have documented that IRGC forces were responsible for killing at least 7,000 people during the nationwide anti-government protests that broke out in December of 2025, in the months immediately preceding the war. That is an enormous, recent, well-documented death toll inflicted by the same security apparatus now organizing and securing Khamenei's funeral, and it sits directly behind the muted or absent enthusiasm from large portions of the Iranian population that outside analysts have pointed to when cautioning against reading this week's crowds as genuine popular support. One 32-year-old woman, whose brother was killed during those December protests, told reporters that Khamenei's funeral gave her little comfort, speaking anonymously out of fear of government retaliation even now, months later. That single testimony captures something the crowd-sized debate alone can't. An enormous, recent, unresolved grievance sitting directly underneath the state-organized mourning currently dominating international coverage, one the government has made no visible effort to address or even publicly acknowledge during 6 days of ceremonies ostensibly about national unity and healing. That tension, Between a government asking its population to mourn collectively and a population that includes families still grieving people the same government's security forces killed less than a year ago, is arguably the deepest and least visible fracture running underneath everything else happening at this funeral. The competing chants between hardliners and Mojtaba loyalists get more attention because they're dramatic and easy to film. The quieter, more diffuse resentment from families of protest victims, expressed mostly through absence and anonymous testimony rather than public chanting, may ultimately matter more for Iran's long-term stability precisely because it doesn't require any specific political faction to organize or activate it. It's simply there, distributed across a population large enough that Iran's own analysts estimate genuine regime support at 15 to 20%, meaning the overwhelming majority of the country is, at best, watching this funeral with detachment, and at worst, watching it with active resentment toward the same security forces currently providing its protection. Layer that domestic tension against the international threats hanging over the funeral specifically, and you get a genuinely precarious security environment that goes well beyond ordinary crowd management. Israel's defense minister stated explicitly in comments reported before the funeral even began that Mojtaba Khamenei was marked for death, language serious enough that Iranian authorities implemented a complete closure of Tehran's airspace during the main procession and mounted what's been described as the largest security operation in the Islamic Republic's history. Any successful attack during a ceremony drawing crowds in the hundreds of thousands, regardless of the exact true attendance figure, carried genuine potential for mass casualties, and senior Iranian officials appearing in public throughout the week faced real, credible personal risk simply by attending. That's the environment Ahmad Vahidi and the rest of Iran's surviving senior military leadership chose to appear in publicly, while the one figure with arguably the most fear and the most reason for outside observers to expect might stay hidden did exactly that for the entire 6-day duration. Zoom out to the full picture this funeral leaves behind as it concludes. A government that lost its supreme leader in a single strike back in February is now 4 months removed from that loss, having spent the intervening period managing an active war, a fragile ceasefire, a nuclear inspection standoff, a fight over control of the Strait of Hormuz, an escalating Kurdish insurgency along its western border, and now a funeral that's revealed real, camera-documented internal division over exactly how the succession should actually work. The name successor still hasn't shown his face publicly, even at the one event explicitly designed to demonstrate the regime's continuity and strength. Competing factions use the same funeral procession to chant different, occasionally contradictory messages about whether negotiations with Washington should even continue. And underneath all of it sits a population whose genuine political sentiment, by the most credible outside estimates available, runs somewhere between 4-1 and 5-1 against the very government currently asking it to mourn collectively. None of that means Iran's government is on the verge of collapse, and it would be a mistake to read 6 days of funeral chaos as proof of imminent regime failure. Governments have survived far more visible internal fractures than what's been on display this week, and Iran's security apparatus, however weakened by the war's opening strikes, remains one of the most extensive in the region, with a demonstrated willingness to use lethal force against domestic dissent at a scale that's already claimed thousands of lives in the past year alone. What this funeral has done is strip away, in front of international cameras Iran itself chose to admit, any pretense that the succession from Khamenei to his son is a smooth, uncontested, universally supported transition. It isn't. The chant said as much. The leaflet said as much. Mojtaba's own continued absence, 6 days into ceremonies honoring his father, says as much all by itself. Whatever comes out of the negotiating rooms in Doha once this funeral period formally concludes and diplomacy resumes, it will be shaped by a government whose internal cohesion looks considerably shakier today than it did before the cameras started rolling on Tehran's streets this week. There's a specific piece of this story worth returning to, because it may end up mattering more for the near-term trajectory of this conflict than any single chant or leaflet. The explicit public threat Israel's defense minister made against Mojtaba personally, delivered while his father's coffin was still moving through Tehran's streets, stating outright that any future Iranian leader who pursues plans against Israel will face the same fate his father did, isn't diplomatic ambiguity. It's a direct warning aimed at a specific named individual who hasn't even formally consolidated power yet. That kind of statement puts Mojtaba in a genuinely difficult position before he's even had the opportunity to establish his own governing approach. If he emerges from hiding and adopts a hardline posture consistent with the funeral's angriest chants, he confirms Israel's stated concern and potentially validates further action against him personally. If he instead signals a more moderate approach, he risks looking weak to exactly the hardline factions whose chants dominated this week's ceremonies, factions that have already shown, through the negotiations forbidden slogan and the loyalty leaflet, that they're prepared to publicly pressure whoever holds the position. That bind, threatened from outside if he's too aggressive, undermined from inside if he's too conciliatory, may be the single best explanation for why Mojtaba has chosen invisibility over any public statement at all during this entire period. Rather than either wounds from the February strike or pure security caution alone, silence lets him avoid committing to either posture while Iran's competing factions continue working out, largely without his direct public involvement, how much room he'll actually have to maneuver once he does eventually step into public view. That's a genuinely unusual position for a head of state to occupy during his own predecessor's funeral, absent by choice or by necessity from the one ceremony explicitly designed to demonstrate that the succession is settled and secure. It's also worth considering what this funeral reveals about the broader shape of Iran's remaining regional alliances, because the guest list and the messaging both point toward a narrower, more defensive coalition than Iran commanded before this war began. Syria's previous government, a longtime Iranian ally, is gone entirely, replaced by a new administration with no comparable relationship to Tehran. Lebanon's Hezbollah, still represented through flags waved by mourners along the funeral route, has been significantly degraded by the broader conflict and faces its own disarmament deadline under terms Iran had limited ability to shape. The remaining attendees, Russia, Pakistan, Iraq's government, Afghanistan, Hamas, represent a coalition held together as much by shared adversarial relationships with the United States and Israel as by any deep ideological alignment with Iran's specific brand of theocratic governance. That's a meaningfully smaller and more defensive circle of genuine support than Iran could have assembled at a comparable event 5 or 6 years ago, before this war stripped away several of its more capable regional proxies and forced remaining allies to calculate their own exposure more carefully. There's a final dimension worth adding about how this funeral fits into the broader information war being fought alongside the actual shooting war, because Iran's decision to grant broad international media access wasn't simply about pride or triumphant messaging. It may have reflected miscalculation almost as significant as anything happening inside the succession fight itself. State planners presumably expected international coverage to focus on turnout numbers and displays of national unity and grief, reinforcing the narrative that Iran's population remains firmly behind its government despite months of war and economic hardship. What actually happened, viewed through the lens of outlets willing to look past the surface-level crowd footage, was international coverage focused heavily on assassination chants, factional infighting, a conspicuously absent successor, and independent skepticism from historians and analysts about whether any of this represents genuine popular support at all. If Iran's government intended this funeral to project strength and continuity to a watching world, the actual coverage that emerged suggests the opposite effect took hold in significant portions of the international press, a reminder that opening your most important national ceremony to skeptical outside cameras carries real risk when the underlying reality doesn't match the intended narrative as cleanly as planners hoped it would. What happens next depends heavily on questions that remain genuinely unresolved as this funeral period draws toward its conclusion. Whether Mojtaba eventually appears publicly once the burial in Mashhad concludes, and what posture he adopts when he does, will tell observers considerably more about the actual balance of power inside Iran's leadership than anything visible during the funeral itself. Whether the negotiating track with Washington resumes on anything resembling its previous footing, or whether the hardline chants heard throughout this week translate into genuine new constraints on what Iran's negotiators are willing to offer, will become clear only once formal talks restart. And whether the deeper, quieter resentment from families of last year's protest victims, the resentment that doesn't show up in dramatic chants or viral footage, but that outside analysts consistently point to when questioning the true scale of regime support, eventually finds any organized political expression, or continues simmering beneath the surface indefinitely, may end up mattering more for Iran's long-term stability than any single event captured on camera this week. None of those questions have confirmed answers yet. What's confirmed is that Iran spent 6 days trying to stage a funeral demonstrating unity and strength. And what international cameras actually captured, cameras Iran's own government chose to admit, was a fractured political establishment, a hidden successor competing chants pulling in opposite directions, and a population whose true sentiment, by every credible outside measure available, runs overwhelmingly against the very government asking it to grieve as one.